Welcome to EB5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shah, and other attorneys at Mona Shah & Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB5 Investment Voice.
Hello, Mark.
Hey, Mona.
Mark, for many EB5 investors, EB5 financing structures, well, that's such a mouthful, is often so confusing. And we've had some wonderful guests on this show and so many other guests who can talk about this area. But as there's been such little what I would call real advice out there as to how structures affect projects and the investor's ultimate return of capital, we thought that perhaps we would explain it ourselves beforehand.
I certainly appreciate that, Mona, because it is confusing. I've been doing this show for nearly 5 years, and I still get a little hung up on the different structures of debt versus equity. So I'm kind of glad that we can keep this in-house so I don't embarrass myself in front of yet another guest expert, which is why today I am so thankful and happy to have both Rebecca and Christina joining us on today's show to try and demystify this area. Hello, ladies.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark. I must say this is such a confusing area. It's not so black and white. There are plenty of gray areas in between. Unfortunately, we're very limited to what we can discuss in the next 30 minutes, but we just want to make sure our clients understand some of these important issues. And when I say clients, I don't mean just our investors, but also our developer clients.
Well, the listeners generally, actually, anybody. You don't have to be a client to listen.
Exactly.
All right. So, Rebecca, we see this so many times. Be developers coming to us and they want to prepare an EB5 project and they want to understand where can we fit EB5 in the capital stack. Perhaps we should explain what a capital stack is first.
Well, capital stack is pretty much where are the funds coming from to pretty much fund the project. There's different types of funding. You have let's first discuss, it's very important in a real estate project and how we're, in a real estate project, which is a typical EB5 project, you have your senior loan, which usually comes from an institutional lender. And for most real estate projects, we know that as a construction loan. 2, you have your developer equity, and then, of course, your EB5 capital that comes in thereafter. But for a lot of other businesses, many could be operating. And as we know, Mona, you could have a lot of operating cash flow, but investors still want to know, well, where exactly are the funds coming from in that business?
That's true. And it's also important to note that there are many projects out there which may not have any bank loans at all.
Yeah, and I think that's very important when we're discussing for today and where does EB5 stack up against all these other funding?
Right. Well, Christina, there are different ways EB5 capital can be structured, but there are really just 2 ways.
That's right. So the first is a loan. Usually EB5 capital is structured as a short-term loan, a fixed term of maybe 5 years with some extension options, possibly in the loan agreement. Oftentimes it's secured by an asset. The other option is an equity investment, which is where the project allows you to purchase shares in the company for your investment. And there are 2 different types of equity investments. There's preferred equity and common equity.
Okay, let's start with the loan model first. I want to keep this very brief and so that our listeners do understand. So loan agreements, Rebecca, we've seen tons. We've seen 2 pages. We've seen 102 pages.
Yes, we have. And a lot of times, you get tired of, obviously 2 pages, yes, easily going by, but you miss a lot of information. We always discuss boilerplate language, right, Mona? And a lot of people underestimate boilerplate language, but
what do you mean by boilerplate language?
Well, a lot of times in boilerplate language, you see the same language over and over again, right? It's commonplace in all of these agreements or loan documents that we see. But a lot of times clients need to understand that it's not just a waste of time or paper. There's a lot of legal significance in these documents.
Right.
One little word can change a meaning of a paragraph.
Right.
A lot of boilerplate language has, for instance, the assignment of loans. And this is very, very important because in non-EB5 projects, that's fine. But in EB5, under the rules and regulations, you cannot do that.
Right. So what you're saying is that you have to read the loan documents, especially if they've been prepared by a non-EB5 attorney.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So collateral is often part of a loan agreement. Christina, just so that we're clear, what is collateral and where have we seen it in EB5 loan agreements?
A collateral is something that secures the loan. That means when the loan goes into default, you can foreclose on that collateral. Essentially, it will be sold, and then the funds taken from that sale are then given back to the investors. And so usually in EB5, in more traditional real estate projects, the collateral is the actual property that's being built, right? So either the land or the building that is structured.
Yeah, but we've seen projects actually where the collateral, well, many projects where collateral is another property, not necessarily the property that's being built.
That's right. So in, let's say, technology projects, the collateral might be intellectual property, the idea, or in some other pharmaceutical projects, it might be the actual product that the project is creating.
Right. Well, collateral could be absolutely anything as long as there has some value to it.
Yeah, you have to have some kind of recourse.
That's right.
And knowing that collateral has some kind of, or asset has some kind of value to it.
Rebecca, does a loan have to be secured to be, I'm talking about the loan to the NCE that the NCE will make. Does it have to be secured to be valid in EB5?
No, it does not need to be secured. There are a lot of unsecured loans. And I know everyone says, well, isn't secured better? Isn't it safer? Not necessarily, right? You can have collateral that, as I was saying earlier, that has no value to it. So if you default on the loan, what is your recourse? What do you actually get from that value or from the property?
We have an example of that, right? There's a project where there is a piece of property which is used as collateral, and we found much later that that piece of land had already been used as collateral for 2 other loans.
Exactly. So that's where we run into issues. And I think clients need to understand, where does that loan stand? And I think what's also important, Mona, is we've seen it now with COVID. We've seen that maybe the value of this property 2 years ago may have been worth 100 million. And unfortunately, as things have gone with the pandemic, we have seen the property value decrease in certain areas, but it could also have increased in others.
Yeah, that's true. So the other thing that you need to look at in a loan agreement, I mean, there's lots of things. One of the things which we really want to point out is our fees, the fees that would be paid to third parties.
Yes. So I think a lot of our clients, you need to understand that fees can be paid from the interest that's part of this loan agreement. And you need to understand where or who are these fees being paid to and how much. Because ultimately, in the end of the day, Mona, remember, we've seen issues like this in the past in where a third party was getting paid fees from the interest. And then there was an issue from USCIS because they thought that the investor was not actually getting a chance of gain.
I remember that case.
Yeah.
I remember the first time when we saw the initial documents from that, we thought, does USCIS really read the small print? But obviously they did.
They did. And it was a very small percentage, but they themselves picked out the fact that even though the NCE, so I remember the loan is going from the JCE to the NCE, although they were getting the interest payments based on this loan, it wasn't actually being paid out to the investors themselves. It was being paid in third-party fees.
Yeah. And what happens if all the money gets paid out to third-party fees and there isn't anything going back to the NCE and ultimately the investor?
Exactly. And again, the chance of gain, there's no chance of gain for the investors. Remember, it has to be a chance of gain and a risk of loss. So they have to have the potential of losing their EB5 capital, but there should be some gain and hence the interest rate to the investor.
So what you're saying is that if all the fees in the loan agreement are such that there is no chance of an EB5 investor getting any money, even if it's $1, then their case could be denied by USCIS as being against the regulations.
Yes, it can be.
USCIS is right then to be picky about the at-risk, I think.
Yeah. And again, I can't emphasize enough on how important language is in your loan agreements. Make sure that, every penny, every percentage is being counted for and where it's actually going.
Yeah, language is important, Rebecca, in loans, but it's also equally as important in any documents relating to equity. So let's move on. Let's move on from loans to equity. Christina, there are two types of equity for EB5 capital, preferred and common. What's the difference?
So there are two kinds of equity, as you've said, preferred and common. Now, preferred equity always comes before common equity in the capital stack. So it does have priority. And it also has a guaranteed rate of return. Now, we use the term guaranteed in the documents, but it's not exactly guaranteed. It's more of a set rate of return for the preferred equity investor, whereas common is a little bit different. It does come after preferred equity, and it doesn't have a specific rate, which means you might get less than the preferred equity investors, but you also might get more.
Well, I think a good way to understand the difference, perhaps an easier way, I know for myself, is that preferred equity is first, and then common equity is after you've paid everything else.
That's right. And you could see huge returns on your investment, theoretically. It just depends on how well the project does. So there's higher risk of gain and a higher risk of loss.
Christina, remember, common and preferred equity is always junior to loans, correct?
Yes, that's right.
We're talking about bank loans.
Well, any loans, yeah.
Or any, yeah.
Or any loans. Well, another point of difference that I'd like to bring up that we get asked about is how do I get my money back if my money is a preferred or a common equity? And again, this is after you get your green card, remember, when you do want your money back. But at that point, the money, the capital is paid back out of retained earnings. It's important to remember that while equity investments are less secured, USCIS really requires that, the EB5 capital invested remains at risk. So even a debt structure is not as secure in the EB5 context.
Well, Mona, let me ask you. I get what Christina was saying. Essentially, preferred equity comes first, and then there's common. Preferred is somewhat locked in. Sometimes they use that language guaranteed, even though it's not a guarantee. But it's locked in, where the common could go up or could go down. It could be undervalued. It could be overvalued, or maybe appropriately valued. It's worth more than what you thought it could be, or it could be worth less. I'm confusing myself, right? And this is why it's such a confusing thing. But the crux of the question remains, regardless if we're talking about preferred equity or common equity, me as an investor, how do I get my money back? How do I get paid?
Well, that's a very good question. We're not talking about loans here, but in a loan agreement, the loan agreement gets paid back. When we're talking about preferred equity or common equity, it's paid out of retained earnings. So if it's, for example, a real estate structure and you're waiting for the sale or refinance, then once that is done, whatever's left over after all the bills are paid, after the loans are paid, that's where you get your money back. If it's a project which has operating cash flow and the income is coming through operating money, then you have to wait until the end of the year, all the bills are paid, and you get paid out of retained earnings.
This seems like a lot. I want to throw something in here. Let's say I have my real estate project. We have EB5 capital, but what if the project does file for bankruptcy now? What would have been the best option for the investor? Would debt have been better or equity?
Well, I'm going to answer first, then I'm going to ask Christina to jump in, because if a project goes bankrupt, saying that there's any money there left, I would say no to a debt or a loan unless collateral is there and you can collateralize from, say, some other area. If you have good collateral, fine. Otherwise, as a recipient of a loan, you would just be further down the creditor list. Whereas as an equity holder, you still have a chance of getting something out of whatever's left.
That's right. So if the loan is secured and the value of the collateral is high enough, then yes, I think debt would be the preferred method. But if it's not secured, really an unsecured EB5 loan versus a preferred equity investment are probably going to be about the same place in receiving a return.
Well, can I ask, does it make a difference? Because we're talking about loan and you have your collateral, but then we have a lot of projects where it's not real estate. As we discussed that earlier, you have a lot of real estate projects out there. We have the land as collateral, right? And now we have more projects coming in as tech, pharma, et cetera. And the final product is the actual collateral. So in a scenario like this, if that project is bankrupt, would it have been better to have a loan or equity?
Yeah, here I would say equity. If, for example, the final product is intellectual property, and that intellectual property has a value. But again, bankruptcies don't happen that often, and I don't want to get into all bankruptcy laws and stuff. But the structure that most of the time investors really just need to understand the project and then to understand the structure. I would like to console everybody that, both are safe, whether you take a loan or whether you take preferred equity or common equity. But it is still important to understand the differences.
Well, Mona, I'm glad that the bankruptcies are not the common case. It's an infrequent thing, but it's something that you do keep an eye on. But for the majority of the projects, those that don't go bankrupt, right? Not those one-off outliers. For me as an investor, what has a higher return on my investment? Would it be a loan or equity?
Well, usually, Mark, it really doesn't make, the rate of return doesn't really make a difference whether it's structured as a loan or whether it's structured as equity.
But not necessarily. Remember, common equity, you could get a much higher return. It's not capped and set the way it is for preferred equity or the loan model.
That's a very good point. That's true. But again, with common equity, you do have the risk. You have a higher risk where you don't have that in a loan.
Exactly.
Right.
I guess it's somewhat of an investor gut feeling. Do they believe that the project is just going to pay off and complete as written, or do they really have faith that it could soar?
Well, again, I think also investors need to see where the money is coming from to pay them interest. If it's an operating project, do you really want to take a high interest amount and take away from the cash flow? If it's a project where you know that they're going to sell the project after a year or two and it's going to go into redeployment, then yeah, I would definitely ask for a higher rate of interest if I could. So I think it really depends on the project.
Well, Mona, Christy, what about the timing of the loan? And does that matter because EB5, obviously you could get paid back after your I-29 stage. Let's say we're talking about 5 years, but does it matter loan versus equity?
Absolutely. So in a loan model, there's going to be a set time frame. So 5 years, like you said, and oftentimes those loan agreements will give the project the ability to extend a little bit if they need to. Whereas equity, even if they give you a time frame, it's not set in stone the way it is with a loan. With a loan, if you go over the time allotted, it's default. It's a default, and the investors can go after the asset if the loan is collateralized. With equity, you can't.
Yeah.
So theoretically, in equity, you don't have to be paid back until it could be 10 years. It could be 20 years. I'm saying theoretically, not to panic anyone.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, technically. And from that payback, you could get paid back maybe not all your 500 plus the interest all at the same time either. It could be paid back maybe, in monthly payments or interest, depending on how much is in the retained earnings.
And it sounds like in a loan structure, the project developers have a vested interest to pay the EB5 investors on time. Otherwise, they could lose a lot of it or all of it.
Well, loan restructuring is a big deal right now, especially with COVID. And quite frankly, Mark, when a project takes a loan in 5 years, it's very rare that they can pay back in 5 years. I think in all of our times of doing EB5, yes, people do get paid back, but it's not often that it's 5 years. It's more like 8 years or 9 years.
But Christina, Mona, I'm a little confused. But Christina, you just said that loans, if it's got a 5-year maturity rate, that in 5 years, the developers need to pay off that loan or it could go into default. Mona, what you were saying is sometimes, perhaps it's commonplace, that loans may restructure. What does that mean for me as the EB5 investor? Is that something I have to buy in on? Do I get money now and later? What happens?
Really, this comes back to you have to look at the documents. The documents are going to tell you how the managing member of the project can restructure the loan. And so sometimes it means the managing member can just make changes of his own accord. But usually, and if you look at the documents, you'll see oftentimes the investors have the ability to choose whether they allow this or not. And that way, the managing member will have to explain why they're restructuring and how it benefits the investors to opt into that restructure.
And Mona, oftentimes what we have seen is when they do restructure or have to include a longer term period, we have seen a negotiation of higher interest rate.
Yeah. Well, that's the one advantage. You can negotiate that. I would like to add here, though, when we are talking about, deciding which structure to have, our listeners should understand anything to do with direct, any entrepreneurial type of project, direct visas has to be an equity model. You can't have a loan model because you can't loan to yourself.
That's right, Mona. And one more thing we want to bring out that's very important, both for investors and developers, is the tax treatment of those interest payments. So in a debt scenario, when you have an EB5 loan, the interest payments are tax deductible, which means the project can use pre-tax money to pay the interest to the investors. In an equity model, it's not, which means it costs a little bit more to pay those interest payments because you have to pay after taxes have been deducted.
Yeah, it's a good point about taxes because with equity, really what you're getting is what's left over in retained earnings. And it's that earnings piece that's key. You pay taxes on earnings, and then what is retained in those earnings is what you pay out. So that's a good thing to think about, where a loan, it's part of your operating expenses. And yeah, I could see how that would be tax deductible for those businesses.
Very good, Mark. You've got it.
I get a gold star.
Well, I'm sure we're going to talk about this subject again, but I hope that this was informative.
Well, ladies, thank you for taking the time to explain this all to me, and hopefully this sheds some light on this for the listener. We've talked about both debt versus equity, loan versus ownership, and various stacks, position in those stacks, payout options, even language, and how important language plays as a piece in all of this. And of course, taxes. And I realize we're going to talk about this again with some other experts in the EB5 industry, but I'm glad that you were able to educate me before those guests come on. So thank you all for that opportunity.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Mark.
Well, we hope it was simplified enough.
Thank you for being with us today on EB5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shah and Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's mshawlaw.com. Make sure you don't miss our next episode focusing on a different aspect of the EB5 program by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB5 Investment Voice.